The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Pine Ridge like a shroud, and Jake Morrison stood at his kitchen window watching his 80-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan, play in the backyard of their modest cabin. The coffee, in his weathered hands, had grown cold, but he barely noticed. His attention was focused on something that had been nagging at him all week: the strange animal tracks he'd found near their property line. For 3 years since the divorce, Jake had been raising the twins alone in this remote mountain town, working as a park ranger to make ends meet. Their mother, Victoria Sterling, had walked away from their marriage and her children to pursue her business empire in New York City. The divorce settlement had been swift and brutal. Victoria got her freedom and her billions, while Jake got full custody and the responsibility of raising 2 children on a ranger's salary. "Dad, look what we found." Emma's voice carried across the yard as she held up what appeared to be a large animal track cast in the mud near their garden. Jake set down his coffee and walked outside, his trained eye immediately recognizing the distinctive pattern. Bear tracks. Large ones. And they were fresh, probably from the night before. "That's a big bear print, sweetheart," Jake said, kneeling beside his daughter while keeping his voice calm. Emma and Ethan had inherited their mother's sharp intelligence, but they were still children who didn't need to know how concerned their father actually was. "Is it dangerous?" Ethan asked, his dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses that made him look older than his 8 years. "Bears usually avoid people," Jake replied carefully. "But we need to be extra careful when we're playing outside, okay? Stay close to the house." What Jake didn't tell his children was that these tracks were different from the usual black bear signs he encountered in his work. These were massive, suggesting a grizzly bear, which was unusual for this area. Even more concerning, the tracks led directly toward the elementary school that sat just half a mile down the mountain road. As the regional park ranger for Pine Ridge, Jake knew every animal pattern in a 50-mile radius. Bears didn't typically come this close to populated areas unless something was driving them from their natural territory. Drought had been severe this summer, and food sources in the higher elevations were scarce. Desperate animals made unpredictable choices. The radio on his belt crackled to life. "Jake, we've got a situation at Pine Ridge Elementary. Can you respond immediately?" Jake's heart rate spiked. "What kind of situation?" "Dispatch. Principal Martinez is reporting a large bear in the school playground. All children are locked inside, but they need an expert assessment." Emma and Ethan looked up at their father with wide eyes. They attended Pine Ridge Elementary, and many of their classmates would be arriving for school within the hour. "Kids, we need to go right now," Jake said, his emergency training taking over. "Get in the truck. We're going to help make sure everyone at your school stays safe." The drive down the mountain road took only 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Jake's mind raced through protocols and procedures, while Emma and Ethan sat quietly in the back seat. Sensing the seriousness of the situation, even if they didn't fully understand it, Pine Ridge Elementary sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. A small school that served the children of rangers, loggers, and the few hardy families who had chosen to make their lives in this remote mountain community. As they approached, Jake could see Principal Martinez standing outside the main building, talking rapidly into her phone. "Mr. Morrison, thank goodness you're here," she called as Jake parked the truck. "The bear appeared about 20 minutes ago. It's a huge animal, bigger than anything I've ever seen. The children who were here early for breakfast program are all safely inside. But we can't let anyone leave until this situation is resolved." Jake scanned the playground and spotted the bear immediately. It was indeed a grizzly, probably weighing close to 600 pounds, and it was exhibiting behavior that made Jake's professional instincts scream danger. Instead of foraging or moving through the area, the bear was pacing, agitated, and showing signs of territorial aggression. "Has anyone tried to scare it off?" Jake asked. The custodian, Mr. Peters, banged some pots together from the kitchen door, but it just seemed to make the animal more aggressive. It actually charged toward the building before stopping about 20 feet away. Jake felt his stomach drop. A bear that didn't retreat from human noise and activity was either sick, injured, or protecting something. None of those scenarios were good news for the children locked inside the school. "Dad, why isn't the bear leaving?" Emma asked, pressing her face against the truck window. "Sometimes animals get confused or scared, just like people do," Jake explained. Though he suspected this situation was much more serious than confusion, he opened his truck's equipment box and retrieved his tranquilizer rifle. A piece of equipment he'd hoped never to use in a populated area. Standard protocol would be to call for backup from the state wildlife department. But the nearest help was 3 hours away, and school buses would be arriving soon. "Principal Martinez, I need you to keep everyone inside and away from windows. Call the parents and tell them school is delayed until further notice. And contact the state wildlife department. Tell them we have a grizzly exhibiting aggressive behavior near a school." As Jake prepared his equipment, he noticed something that made the situation even more complex. About 100 yards behind the school, near the edge of the tree line, he could see movement. Through his binoculars, he confirmed his worst fear. There were cubs. 2 young grizzly cubs, probably 8 months old, were playing in the brush behind the school. The adult bear wasn't lost or confused. She was a mother protecting her babies, and her babies were between the school and the forest. Any attempt to move the mother bear would require somehow relocating the cubs first, and approaching grizzly cubs with their mother nearby was one of the most dangerous situations in wildlife. Management. Jake's radio crackled again. "All units, we've got reports of a school bus breakdown on Mountain Ridge Road. Bus 47 with 15 children is stranded about 2 miles from Pine Ridge Elementary. Driver is requesting immediate assistance." The situation had just become exponentially more complicated. Not only did they have a protective mother grizzly threatening the school, but a bus full of children was stranded on a mountain road in the same area where Jake had been tracking unusual bear activity all week. Emma, Ethan, I need you both to listen very carefully, Jake said, kneeling beside the truck so he could look his children in the eyes. I have to go help some other children who are in trouble, but you're going to stay here with Principal Martinez where it's safe. But Dad, what about the bear? Ethan asked, his voice small but brave. I'm going to take care of the bear problem, but first I need to help the children on the bus. Mrs. Martinez will keep you safe inside the school. What Jake didn't tell his children was that he suspected the bus had broken down in the territory of the male grizzly whose tracks he'd been finding all week. If his theory was correct, they weren't dealing with one dangerous bear situation, but 2 separate incidents involving a mated pair of grizzlies who had been pushed from their normal territory by drought and food scarcity. The next 30 minutes would test every skill Jake had learned in 10 years of wildlife management, and the decisions he made could determine whether children lived or died. As he loaded his tranquilizer rifle and prepared to leave his own children in the relative safety of the locked school, Jake Morrison had no idea that someone in New York City was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. Victoria Sterling was in the middle of a board meeting for her multinational technology company when her assistant knocked on the conference room door. Victoria had built Sterling Technologies from a small startup into a billion-dollar empire through relentless focus and the ability to eliminate distractions, including, as her former husband had painfully learned, distractions like family obligations. I specifically said, no interruptions, Victoria said coldly. Ma'am, it's about your children. There's an emergency situation in Pine Ridge. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She hadn't spoken to Emma and Ethan in 6 months, hadn't seen them in over a year, and had convinced herself that they were better off without her complicated presence in their lives. Jake was a good father, she'd told herself, and children needed stability more than they needed a mother who worked 18-hour days and traveled constantly. What kind of emergency? Victoria asked, her business instincts taking over even as her heart rate spiked. A bear situation at their school. The local authorities are requesting emergency evacuation assistance, and your ex-husband is apparently leading some kind of rescue operation, Victoria stood abruptly, her mind already calculating travel times and resources. Cancel all my meetings today, get my helicopter ready for immediate departure, and contact the best wildlife experts money can hire. I want them in Pine Ridge within 3 hours. As Victoria Sterling prepared to leave her boardroom for the first time in years without a predetermined agenda or profit motive, Jake Morrison was climbing into his truck with a tranquilizer rifle and the weight of multiple lives on his shoulders. Neither of them knew that the next few hours would force them to confront truths about family, responsibility, and what really mattered when everything else was stripped away. The mountain road to the stranded school bus was treacherous under the best conditions, and Jake navigated the winding curves while his radio crackled with updates that grew more concerning with each transmission. The bus driver reported seeing a large bear near the vehicle, and the children were growing frightened and restless. Jake Morrison had spent his adult life protecting wildlife and educating people about coexisting with dangerous animals. Today, he would learn whether his skills were sufficient to protect the people who mattered most to him, including the 2 children he'd left behind in a school that was still under threat from a mother grizzly who would kill to protect her cubs. The school bus sat at an awkward angle on Mountain Ridge Road, its front wheels hanging precariously over the edge of a steep embankment. Jake could see 15 young faces pressed against the windows as he approached, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Bus driver Margaret Chen, a woman in her 50s who had been driving these mountain roads for 20 years, met him at the door with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here, Jake. The engine just died about an hour ago, and then we saw the bear. It's been circling the bus for the past 30 minutes. Jake scanned the tree line and spotted the male grizzly immediately. This bear was even larger than the female at the school, probably pushing 700 pounds. And his behavior was distinctly different. Where the mother bear had been agitated and protective, this male was displaying hunting behavior. He was stalking, testing, looking for weakness or opportunity. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to keep the children absolutely quiet and away from the windows," Jake said, loading a tranquilizer dart into his rifle. "This bear is exhibiting predatory behavior, which means loud noises or sudden movements could trigger an attack." Through the bus windows, Jake could see children ranging in age from 6 to 12, including several he recognized from Emma and Ethan's school. Tommy Martinez, whose father ran the local grocery store. Sarah Williams, whose mother worked at the post office. Lisa and David Park, siblings whose parents had moved to Pine Ridge to escape city life. These weren't just statistics or rescue scenarios. These were children he knew, families he cared about, a community he'd sworn to protect. The male grizzly suddenly stood on his hind legs, towering nearly 9 feet tall, and let out a roar that shook the bus windows. Several children started crying. Despite Mrs. Chen's efforts to keep them calm, Jake's radio crackled with an update that made his heart sink. "Jake, we've got a problem at the school. The mother bear has moved closer to the building. She's now about 10 feet from the main entrance, and we can see the cubs moving toward the playground. If those cubs get between the mother and the forest, she's going to become exponentially more dangerous." The situation was deteriorating on multiple fronts, and Jake faced an impossible choice. The children on the bus needed immediate help, but Emma and Ethan were trapped at the school with their increasingly agitated mother grizzly. Standard wildlife management protocol called for patience, careful planning, and backup support. But there was no time for protocol when children's lives hung in the balance. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to try to tranquilize this bear, but it's going to take several minutes for the drug to take effect. If something goes wrong, if the bear charges the bus, I need you to get on the radio and call for emergency helicopter evacuation. The landing zone is the school parking lot." Jake stepped out of his truck and immediately felt the weight of the grizzly's attention. The massive animal dropped to all fours and turned to face him, recognizing him as either a threat or potential prey. At this distance, about 50 yards, Jake had one shot to place the tranquilizer dart in the optimal location. Too low, and it might not penetrate the bear's thick hide. too high, and he could hit bone or miss entirely. And if the first shot failed, there wouldn't be time for a second. The bear began moving toward him with a deceptively quick gait that could cover ground faster than most people could run. Jake steadied his rifle, controlled his breathing, and fired. The dart hit the grizzly in the shoulder, a perfect placement that would deliver the tranquilizer directly into muscle tissue. But instead of slowing down, the bear seemed to become more agitated. It let out another roar and charged directly toward the bus. Jake realized with horror that the tranquilizer might actually increase the animal's aggression before the sedative effect took hold. "Everyone get down," Jake shouted, reaching for his backup weapon, a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with bear spray rounds. The grizzly slammed into the side of the bus with enough force to rock the entire vehicle. Children screamed as windows rattled, and the bus tilted further toward the embankment. Jake fired 3 bear spray rounds in rapid succession, creating a cloud of irritant that surrounded the grizzly's head. The animal backed away, shaking its massive head and pawing at its eyes. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it circled around to the back of the bus, where the emergency exit provided a potential entry point. "Mrs. Chen, move all the children to the front of the bus now," Jake commanded, reloading his shotgun while keeping his eyes on the grizzly. The bear was beginning to show signs of the tranquilizer's effect. Its movements were becoming slightly less coordinated, but it was still extremely dangerous. The radio in his truck crackled with an emergency update. "All units, we have a helicopter approaching Pine Ridge Elementary. Pilot is requesting immediate landing clearance and ground support." Jake felt a moment of confusion. He hadn't requested helicopter support, and the state wildlife department's aircraft was still hours away. But there was no time to process this information because the grizzly had found the bus's emergency exit and was testing the door with its massive paws. Working on pure instinct and years of emergency training, Jake approached the bear from behind, making himself as large and threatening as possible. Hey bear, get away from there." He fired another bear spray round directly at the animal's hindquarters. The combination of tranquilizer and irritant finally began to take effect. The grizzly turned away from the bus and stumbled toward the tree line, its movements becoming increasingly unsteady. Within 5 minutes, the massive animal collapsed in a clearing about 100 yards away. Breathing heavily, but no longer a threat. "Bus is secure," Jake radioed to dispatch. "Male grizzly is down. Beginning evacuation of children to safety zone." But even as he helped 15 frightened children off the bus and into his truck for transport to the school, Jake's mind was racing. With concern about Emma and Ethan, the radio updates from Pine Ridge Elementary had stopped coming, which either meant the situation was under control or had become too critical for routine communication. The helicopter he'd heard about was approaching. As Jake and the bus children reached the school, it was a sleek, expensive-looking aircraft with corporate markings that Jake didn't recognize. As it settled into the parking lot, kicking up dust and debris, Jake saw a woman emerge who made his heart skip a beat. Victoria Sterling looked exactly as he remembered her, tall and elegant with dark hair pulled back in a business-appropriate style, wearing clothes that probably cost more than he made in a month. But her usual composed expression had been replaced by something Jake had rarely seen during their marriage: genuine fear and concern. "Where are Emma and Ethan?" Victoria demanded, striding toward him with the purposeful gait that had once intimidated corporate competitors around the world. "They're safe inside the school," Jake replied, his professional training helping him maintain composure despite the emotional complexity of seeing his ex-wife for the first time in over a year. "But we still have a mother grizzly with cubs in the area. The situation isn't resolved." Victoria's eyes scanned the playground where the massive female grizzly was still visible, pacing near the swing set with her 2 cubs now clearly visible at the edge of the tree line. "What's your plan?" "Standard protocol is to wait for the cubs to move away from the building, then tranquilize the mother, and relocate the family to a more remote area." "How long will that take?" "Could be hours, could be days. Bears don't operate On human schedules, Victoria studied the situation with the same analytical intensity she brought to complex business problems. What if we could give the bears a reason to leave voluntarily? Create an incentive for them to move away from the school. Jake looked at his ex-wife with surprise. Despite her complete lack of wildlife experience, Victoria was thinking strategically about the problem rather than demanding immediate results. What kind of incentive? Food. You said drought conditions drove them down from their normal territory. What if we could provide an abundant food source in a location that's safe for both the bears and the children? Before Jake could respond, Principal Martinez emerged from the school building with an update that changed everything. Mr. Morrison, I hate to interrupt, but we've got a new problem. One of the cubs has wandered onto the playground. It's between the mother bear and the building now. Jake felt his blood turn to ice. A mother grizzly separated from her cub was one of the most dangerous situations in wildlife management. The female would attack anything and everything between her and her baby, including a building full of children. Everyone needs to get away from the windows immediately, Jake ordered. That mother bear is about to become extremely aggressive. As if summoned by his words, the female grizzly let out a roar that shook the school windows and began charging toward the building. She wasn't testing or exploring anymore. She was attacking what she perceived as a threat to her cub. Victoria grabbed Jake's arm. The children. We have to get them out of there. The building is the safest place right now, Jake replied, but even as he spoke, he could see the massive bear testing the strength of the school's front doors. The building had been constructed in the 1960s, and the doors weren't designed to withstand the assault of a 600-pound grizzly bear. Jake, those doors aren't going to hold, Victoria said. Her business instincts for risk assessment proving accurate even in this wilderness situation. The sound of splintering would confirm her observation. The grizzly's massive paws were leaving deep gouges in the doorframe, and the metal hinges were beginning to bend under the repeated impacts. We need a distraction, Jake said, loading another tranquilizer dart. Something to draw her attention away from the building long enough for me to get a clear shot. Victoria looked at the helicopter that had brought her to Pine Ridge. Then, back at the crisis unfolding in front of them. I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. Right now, I'll consider anything. The helicopter can create enough noise and wind to potentially drive the bears toward the forest. But someone would have to pilot it close enough to the bears to be effective, which means flying at extremely low altitude in dangerous conditions. Jake stared at his ex-wife. Victoria, you can't be serious. You don't know anything about wildlife behavior, and one mistake could make this situation catastrophically worse. I know about calculated risks and emergency decisions, and right now, those children, including our children, need someone to take action instead of waiting for perfect conditions that might never come. Before Jake could protest further, Victoria was running toward the helicopter, shouting instructions. To the pilot, the aircraft's engine spun up to full power, creating a whirlwind of dust and noise that immediately got the mother grizzly's attention. The bear stopped her assault on the school doors and turned toward this new threat, standing on her hind legs to assess the noisy machine approaching her territory. Victoria's pilot, clearly experienced in emergency situations, brought the helicopter in low and fast, using the rotor wash to push the confused cub away from the playground and toward the tree line where its sibling waited. The tactic worked better than Jake had dared hope. The mother grizzly, seeing her cub moving toward safety, abandoned her attack on the school and followed. Within minutes, the entire bear family had retreated into the forest. Driven by the helicopter's noise and the mother's instinct to protect her cubs in familiar territory, Jake Boost did use the distraction to position himself for a clear tranquilizer shot, but as he raised his rifle, he realized it was no longer necessary. The bears were leaving voluntarily, moving deeper into the wilderness where they belonged. Stand down, the bears are retreating. He radioed to all units. Situation is under control. The helicopter settled back into the parking lot, and Victoria emerged, looking windblown but triumphant. For the first time since their divorce, Jake saw the woman he had fallen in love with. brilliant, decisive, and absolutely fearless when the people she cared about were in danger. Principal Martinez opened the school doors cautiously, and children began emerging into the sunlight. Emma and Ethan ran toward their father, but they stopped when they saw Victoria standing beside him. "Mum," Emma said, her voice uncertain. It had been so long since they'd seen their mother that she seemed almost like a stranger. Victoria knelt down to their level, and Jake could see tears in her eyes. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi, Ethan. I came as soon as I heard you were in trouble. Are you staying?" Ethan asked, with the directness that children bring to complicated adult situations. Victoria looked at Jake, then back at their children. "I don't know yet, but I'm here now, and I want to talk to you and your father about some important things." Over the next hour, as wildlife officials arrived to track the relocated bear family and ensure they remained in safe territory, Jake found himself having the most honest conversation with Victoria that they'd had since their marriage began falling apart. "I convinced myself that you were better parents without me," Victoria said as they watched Emma and Ethan play with other children in the no-secure playground. "I told myself that my work was more important, that children needed stability more than they needed a mother who was always traveling and taking phone calls." "The children do need stability," Jake replied carefully, "but they also need to know their mother loves them. I never stopped loving them. I just stopped believing I was good for them." Jake studied his ex-wife's face, seeing vulnerability that she'd never allowed herself to show during their marriage. "What changed your mind?" "Getting a phone call that my children were in danger, and realizing that all the money in the world couldn't protect them if I wasn't willing to be present in their lives. Watching you risk everything to save not just Emma and Ethan, but every child in this community. Understanding that being a good parent isn't about providing perfect conditions, it's about showing up when it matters most." Emma approached them with the straightforward curiosity that had always characterized her personality. "Mum, are you and Dad going to live together again?" Victoria and Jake exchanged glances, both recognizing that their children deserved honest answers to difficult questions. "Sweetheart, your father and I have different lives now," Victoria said gently, "but that doesn't mean I can't be a better mother to you and Ethan. It means I need to find ways to be part of your lives that work for everyone." What kind of ways? Ethan asked, joining the conversation with his characteristic need for specific information. Victoria looked at Jake for permission before continuing. "Well, I was thinking that maybe I could buy a house here in Pine Ridge, somewhere close enough that you could stay with me sometimes, but you'd still live with your father in the home you love." Jake felt his eyebrows rise in surprise. Victoria, Sterling buying property in a remote mountain town was like a CEO deciding to become a park ranger. It seemed impossible to imagine. "You'd really move here?" Jake asked. "Part-time? I can run my company from anywhere with internet access, and Pine Ridge has something New York City never will: the people I care about most." Emma and Ethan looked at their parents with expressions of cautious hope. They were old enough to understand that adult relationships were complicated, but young enough to believe that problems could be solved if everyone involved really wanted to solve them. "Dad, would that be okay with you?" Emma asked. Jake considered the question seriously. His marriage to Victoria had failed because they'd wanted different things and been unwilling to compromise. But today had shown him that Victoria was capable of change, of putting family ahead of business when the stakes were high enough. "I think it could work," Jake said slowly, "as long as we all understand that the children's stability comes first, and any arrangement we make has to be good for them, not just convenient for us." Victoria nodded. "Agreed. And I want to contribute to this community, not just take from it. Pine Ridge needs resources, and I have resources. Maybe there's a way to make both of those things work together." 6 months later, Jake stood in his kitchen watching Emma and Ethan help Victoria plant a vegetable garden behind the house she'd purchased on the other side of town. The arrangement they'd worked out was unconventional but effective. The children spent weekdays with Jake and weekends with Victoria, giving them access to both parents while maintaining the stability they needed. Victoria had kept her promise about contributing to the community. Her foundation had funded a new emergency communication system for the school district, upgraded the medical clinic's equipment, and established a scholarship program for local students pursuing environmental science degrees. She'd even hired Jake as a consultant for a wilderness safety program she was developing for other rural communities. The Bear family, they'd encountered that dramatic day, had been successfully relocated to a remote wilderness area where drought conditions were less severe. Follow-up tracking showed they were thriving in their new territory, and the incident had led to improved protocols for managing human-wildlife conflicts in drought conditions. "Dad, Mom says she wants to learn how to identify animal tracks," Emma called from the garden. "Can you teach her the same way you taught us?" Jake smiled, remembering the morning when Emma had found bear tracks in their yard and started the chain of events that had ultimately brought their family back together in a new configuration. "I think that's a great idea. Your mum's pretty smart. She'll probably be good at it." Victoria looked up from the tomato plants she was struggling to position correctly. "I'm discovering that there's a lot I don't know about living in the mountains. But I'm a fast learner when I'm motivated." "What's your motivation?" Jake asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, Victoria's gaze shifted to Emma and Ethan, who were now engaged in a serious discussion about whether the carrots should be planted in rows or circles. "I spent 3 years believing that success meant building the biggest company and making the most money. It took almost losing the people. I love to understand that real success is measured by the relationships you build and the positive impact you have on the lives of people who matter." As evening settled over Pine Ridge, Jake found himself reflecting on how much their family had changed since that morning when dangerous wildlife had threatened their community. The crisis had forced all of them to confront their priorities and make difficult choices about what kind of life they wanted to build together. Victoria had learned that being a good mother didn't require perfection, just presence and genuine commitment to her children's well-being. Emma and Ethan had gained a better understanding of their parents as complex people who were trying to do their best in complicated circumstances. And Jake had discovered that sometimes the best solutions to impossible problems required collaboration rather than individual heroism. "Dad, are you happy with how everything worked out?" Ethan asked, as they prepared for dinner. Jake looked around the kitchen where his ex-wife was helping his children prepare a meal using vegetables from the garden they'd planted together. It wasn't the life he'd imagined when he and Victoria first got married, and it wasn't the future he'd envisioned during their bitter divorce, but it was something better than either of those scenarios. A family that had learned to adapt, compromise, and put love ahead of pride. "Yes, buddy," Jake said, ruffling his son's hair. "I think everything worked out exactly the way it was supposed to." Outside their windows, the mountain wilderness stretched toward the horizon, home to countless wild creatures living their own complex lives. The bears they'd encountered were thriving in their new territory. The children of Pine Ridge were safe in their classrooms, and a family that had been broken by misunderstandings and conflicting priorities had found a way to rebuild itself around the values that really mattered. Sometimes, Jake reflected, the most important rescues weren't about saving people from external dangers. Sometimes they were about saving relationships from the smaller, more insidious threats of pride, assumption, and the failure to communicate honestly about what everyone involved really needed. As the Morrison family sat down to dinner together, joined by a woman who had once thought success meant choosing between career and family, but had learned that the best successes were measured by the love and respect of the people who knew you best, Jake felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had faced an impossible situation and found a way to make it work. The mountain wilderness around Pine Ridge continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human drama, but somehow supportive of those who chose to live in harmony with its challenges and beauty. And in a small cabin where 3 years of separation had given way to a new kind of family unity, Emma and Ethan Morrison fell asleep, knowing that both their parents loved them enough to change, compromise, and create a future that honored everyone's needs. The story that had begun with dangerous wildlife threatening children had become something much more valuable. A testament to the idea that some relationships are worth fighting for, and that the best solutions to complex problems usually require everyone involved to become better versions of themselves.